It's me, Halloween Dan. Hold on a second. You might be wondering, Dan, why on earth are you dressed like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man from Ghostbusters? And valid question, very valid question. It could be one of any three answers really. The first is, I thought today I wanted to do something special because I have just crossed the 600 threshold. So, yay. But no, I'm not going to go on about it because I said the last time I crossed the threshold, which was at 500, I wasn't going to make a big deal of it. All I'm going to do is say thank you so much if you've recently subscribed and welcome to whatever this is. The second reason is because today I wanted to do something I haven't done for a while, something I love doing, which is instead of talking about props and all the rest of the other things that we enjoy about Halloween, I wanted to talk about Halloween as a subject again. I've done this before, but I wanted to go a little bit more in depth. Some of you might remember that I did videos at Christmas and at Easter where I talked about their pagan and Celtic pasts and how they got kind of adopted by Christianity and why we still do certain traditions today that actually have more to do with the Celtic world and pagan world than they really do to do with Christianity. And I wanted to do one about Halloween. We're in September now. Halloween is basically Halloween, isn't it? Let's just face it. And I wanted to do one about Halloween. But the thing about Halloween is it's very, very convoluted. There's a lot to the history of Halloween, and a lot of different people argue about why we do certain things and why we, and all that sort of stuff. It's very, very contested, some of it. Not all of it is as straightforward as you might imagine. So that video would probably take me about 3 hours to make. So I thought instead what I'd do is I'd break it down. I'd maybe create sort of a series of videos in the run up to Halloween where we talk about an individual tradition at a time. And today's episode, if you hadn't guessed, is costumes. Or the third and more likely reason as to why I'm wearing a Stay Puft Marshmallow Man costume in September is probably just because I'm having a mental breakdown of some sort. Let's find out which one it is. So yes, today we are talking about costumes and digging a bit deeper into the history of Halloween. It's something I love doing. I love talking about this. If you've been with my channel for any length of time, you will have seen similar videos of this. But today I really kind of wanted to get down and deep into the history of Halloween. And I thought the best way was to start by biting it off in chunk-sized bites that you could sort of easily digest. Halloween is such a massive thing to try and dissect in some ways. It's very contested. Lots of different people, lots of different scholars agree and disagree on exactly why we do the things we do for Halloween and exactly when it started and exactly who started them. But of course, costumes in particular, although it's something I've not really ever properly spoken about on this channel, it's weirdly one of the few things I haven't really talked about on this channel. They're a massive part of Halloween, aren't they, costumes? You have to have a Halloween costume. It's probably, along with a few other things, one of the main traditions we think of when we think of Halloween. That idea of getting dressed up and having a costume party or just for trick-or-treating. The costume element of Halloween is one of the biggest parts of Halloween. But why do we do it? Where does it come from? Why do we do that? That's why in this video I'm going to delve back the furthest in this particular one, because we have to go right back to the start of what we believe Halloween's beginnings were to fully understand where these traditions come from. And because this is the first in this particular series I'm going to do, this is the one where we're going to go over this history the most. So bear with me. It's historical, but I hope we all learn something. So Halloween, like so many of our other traditions and celebrations, has its roots in the Celtic pagan past of most of Europe, mostly northwestern Europe, Britain and Ireland. And the name we have to represent that more ancient version of Halloween is a Celtic word. It's an Irish Celtic word, Samhain. Now, this is where it's contested, to be quite honest with you. No one's really sure whether Samhain really was what we now think of as Halloween or whether it was something else. It just kind of got tagged on. And the other thing is, the Celts were not one united people. There were lots of tribes of different people with different beliefs and different ways of doing things. They prayed to different gods. They did things in slightly different ways. So to simply paper it as all as Samhain is kind of not really true to what it really was. And the honest truth is, no one really knows what the earliest versions of Halloween really were or what were going on in people's minds at that time. You know, we think that perhaps some version of what I'm just going to call as Samhain for now was celebrated as early as about 4,000 years ago. So it's been around a very long time. But what was it all about? Well, the simplest version of it is that it was a harvest festival. It was nothing more than that. The harvest came at this time of year. It was late October, early November, and people would gather, they'd light bonfires, they'd share harvest foods with one another in the form of a harvest feast and celebration. And depending upon what part of Europe you were living in at that time, depending on what tribe you belonged to, you might have had different traditions tied in with that. To some, it was nothing more than a harvest. But to other tribes and to other peoples across Europe, a slightly more deeper meaning to what Samhain really was started to grow. To some, it was the end of one year and the beginning of another. So a new year type celebration. And you can kind of understand where that thought might come from. Here you've got the harvest, all the bounty of the earth laid before you. You've spent all summer growing these crops, and suddenly there they are, ready to be eaten. And the world seems full of food and joy and jubilation. But you must have to accept that in only a few weeks, really not very far ahead of you, the world is going to rapidly change, and the darkness and the death and the cold and the emptiness of winter is about to seep into the world. And that must have done strange things to people's heads, knowing that here we have all this stuff, all this food, aren't we so lucky? But just ahead, there'll be almost nothing and the landscape will be dead and barren. That must have created certain strange links in people's minds. And it seems that the strangest link of all that developed out of this was the idea that it was at this time of year that the dead could return to the world of the living. Logical in some ways that ancient people trying to make sense of this world must have thought, well then perhaps this moment that sort of sits between, this bridge between the full bounty of life and the death of winter, maybe this moment is a link between the two. Maybe at this time of year, the veil is at its thinnest. Now, ancient pagan societies, along with worshipping a whole series of gods, also worshipped their ancestors. It was a big part of their tradition. And very much like they do in Mexico around the Day of the Dead, it's thought that the ancient Celts probably gave offerings to their ancestors at grave sites and cemeteries to remember them, to give thanks to them, but also to welcome them to the table as if they had returned from the dead, just for that one special night of the year. And this wasn't so much a frightening, spooky thing. This was a kind of a family-friendly, enjoying the bounty of life with your dead relatives kind of a thing. So this belief that the harvest represented a time of year when the dead could cross over from the world of the dead and commune with the living, it does seem to have perpetuated throughout the early period of Samhain's history. And getting back to the costume element for a second, it is believed by some scholars that it's at this time that the earliest versions of wearing costumes began, because the Celts, in celebration of the harvest, probably wore animal hides and skins to sort of dress themselves up, perhaps to sort of enchant the spirits from the other world to come over to join them. Who really knows? No one really knows, in all honesty. But for millennia, this was really all Samhain was, a celebration of the harvest with this element of giving thanks and offering to the dead. It doesn't really start to change until the Christians appear. As Christianity starts to spread across Europe from about the 5th century to about the 9th and 10th century, what it does, and I've spoken about this before, is rather than put people off by coming in forcefully and telling them what they can and can't do, Christianity adopted a lot of pagan and Celtic tradition into the way Christians would celebrate, so that the Celts wouldn't feel alienated or think of this new religion as an outsider, a foreign invader. They did it for Christmas, they did it for Easter, and they did it for lots of other things too. But Samhain posed a little bit of a problem for them. And here's why. One of the key parts of Christianity is that you don't worship anything other than God. False idol worship and ancestor worship, these pagan ideas, were something the church just couldn't take on. It was so anti-Christian in many ways. And yet, Samhain was all about ancestor worship, tied in with the harvest. And the problem was, the church couldn't cancel the harvest. They couldn't tell people to not have a harvest or have a harvest festival. Of course people were going to do this. How would the church get around this? So what the church did was they tried to distract people. They tried to give people something else to focus their attention on. And what they created were the Saints' Days. On the 1st and 2nd of November, you have the Saints' Days. All Saints' Days on the 1st, All Souls' Day on the 2nd. And the idea was a simple one. It would be a harvest festival, but it would also be, instead of remembering personal ancestors, your own ancestors, you would use these 2 days in the form of a feast to celebrate Christian ancestors, the saints and good Christian souls, martyrs and the likes. And the Christians hoped that that would be enough, that Celts would just sort of see it as so similar, they'd give up this idea of personal ancestor worship and just focus all their attention on the Saints' Days. The problem was, though, that people in Europe wanted their cake and eat it. In other words, they were more than happy to celebrate these 2 new Christian holidays in the form of the holy day. But they also still wanted to light their bonfires and share their harvest foods with their friends and family like they always had done, and also give a little bit of a thanks to their personal ancestors. And what ended up happening was the church, sort of by accident, gave this event legitimacy by creating a not official holiday, but a holiday in its own right. On the 31st of October, All Hallows Eve, the eve before the hallowed days, the Saints' Days. And what ended up happening was just that. People continued to do what they'd always done, the same traditions, the same things, but now they were doing them on the 31st of October and then focusing on the Christian event the next day. But the church still didn't like the idea of people celebrating on the 31st of October. So what they then started to do was say, yeah, you're right, there are spirits around on the 31st of October. It is a very spiritual night. But not all the spirits are very good. In fact, most of them are dangerous, evil spirits, demonic spirits, demons, just waiting to steal you back to hell. So, probably a good idea to not celebrate on the 31st of October. Just stay inside, let that night pass, and then we'll concentrate on the Saints' Days. But people wouldn't have it. And what they eventually ended up doing was creating loopholes, ways of allowing them to still celebrate on the 31st of October, but basically ensuring that demons and evil monsters weren't going to steal them away. And it's at this time period that many of the Halloween traditions we still hold dear to this day start to properly develop in the sort of Middle Ages, really. And one of those things is the costume. Only back then, it was less of a costume and more of a disguise. The idea was a simple one, and it must have made sense to the medieval mind. If there are demons hanging about just waiting to steal me off to hell, then maybe what I'll do is disguise myself. I'll dress myself up wearing a dark cloak, maybe a mask, something to hide my identity. And either the demons will think I'm just another demon and they won't take any notice of me, or they won't be able to recognise me and they won't be able to follow me back to my home and steal me away. It's a simple idea, but it was one that grew in popularity. And so all of a sudden, people would celebrate All Hallows Eve by wearing some form of a disguise to keep their identity secret from wily, sneaky demons that might be hiding in the bushes. And over the centuries, this idea perpetuated. People from time to time would use it more as a costume thing. It developed into costume parties and something similar to what we might know nowadays. Though the Puritans tried to put an end to all that, that's another story. But in honesty, it was still just a disguise. It was really just a way of keeping yourself concealed. But in a way, this also led to another sort of problematic part of All Hallows Eve history. The disguise element, the costume element, didn't only disguise you from demons, but it disguised you from everybody. And so what ended up happening was people who maybe were up to no good would use All Hallows Eve as an excuse to cause trouble. They'd wear their costume and they would create antisocial behaviour. They would go out damaging people's property, robbing people, doing all kinds of quite nefarious things because they were wearing a costume and they could get away with it. Even trick or treat, to a degree, has beginnings in this kind of quite questionable past where because people were wearing a costume and couldn't be recognised, they would actually feel bold enough to go up to people's doors and threaten them. That's what trick or treat is, a threat. Give me something good and I won't damage your property. So the costume element actually became a rather negative thing in the connotation of Halloween. And for many generations, especially here in England, it became often just referred to as Mischief Night because it was a night when the only people out were people who wanted to make mischief, who wanted to cause damage. It had a very negative connotation around it for a long time, particularly in parts of the world like here, where it was just seen as an excuse, basically, for vandals. It would seem that this was also the case in the United States for a long period of time, where Halloween was just an excuse to cause property damage. That was until one woman would change everything for Halloween and bring it right up to date and make it basically the Halloween we all know and love today. And her name was Elizabeth Krebs. I can't remember the town she lived in. I think it was in Ohio. But basically, she, around the beginning of the 20th century, she was fed up of waking up every morning on the 1st of November every year to finding property damage. Her lovely hometown destroyed and by vandals, fences removed, gates removed, gardens destroyed. Just a mess. She was sick of this mischief night. So what she decided to do, she knew she couldn't just cancel it and tell people not to do it because it would, of course, they wouldn't listen to her. But maybe, like the wily Christians long before her, she could change the focus. And so what Miss Elizabeth Krebs did was start to develop it more as a party, as something fun, as a community event. So instead of just allowing youths to run riot across the town, she invited them all to a massive town-wide party where they were encouraged not to wear disguises, but to wear costumes. They'd have a best costume competition. They'd have pumpkin carving and apple bobbing, and they'd dance and listen to music. They'd have sweets and candies and food, all the stuff to basically draw their attention away from being vandals and focus instead on this. And within a couple of years, this had become such a success in this town that this model started to be adopted across the rest of the United States. Whenever it got to that time of year, to Halloween, the focus instead was to switch away from allowing people to just destroy property left, right and centre, but to have a party, to focus all that destructive energy into something fun and frivolous. And a big part of that was the costume element. Because of her, she allowed the costume part of Halloween, which had always been maybe its most frightening part, especially to people who didn't know who was knocking at their door after dark, it turned it into the fun, acceptable part. It made it a fun, family-friendly thing where children would wear costumes and people were encouraged to knock on doors and ask for candies, not to just cause property damage. And thanks to this woman and her efforts, this model of Halloween was eventually adopted across the United States. And then, once American influence in the late 20th century started to really take place in Europe, we started to pick up on this American way of celebrating Halloween, which was far more innocent and fun and about having a fun time and less about mischief and vandalism. And so by now, the costume element of Halloween has fully come into its own. Back when I was a kid, most costumes were homemade, and I think for most of the 20th century, most costumes were homemade. Nowadays, you only have to click on the internet and you can find whatever costume comes into your mind. You want to be a character from your favourite TV show, you be that character. You want to be some really obscure thing that no one's ever thought of? Well, probably someone else has thought of it, and there's a costume for it. What would Halloween be without the costumes? Trick-or-treating would not look anything like what it does now, and it is such a fun part of Halloween, these weird and wacky costumes. So now is the sort of Q&A section where I want you guys to comment in the comment section. What's your go-to costume at Halloween? What do you love to dress up as? What did you use to dress up as a kid? What were your go-tos? Are you one of them people who fully home makes your costume? Are you just dedicated to making your own? You want to be an original costume? Or do you just do what most other people do? Go online, Google something you're quite interested in and find a costume that matches? Or are you a sourpuss and you don't wear a costume because you're too serious to wear a costume? I know plenty of people like that. Anyway, let me know right in the comments. I hope you've liked this video today. It's a bit longer than usual because the history of Halloween is quite long. And I hope you like this little mini series I'm sort of doing in the run up to Halloween because, yeah, we are definitely in the run up to Halloween now. Anyway guys, thank you so much for watching today and I will see you in the next one. Keep it spooky. Bye.